Now, back in September 2024, young Philly was touring in Australia when he performed at a nightclub in Perth and later left with a 20-year-old woman who had described herself as a major fan of his. The two went back to his hotel where both sides agreed that they initially had consensual sex. But according to the woman, the situation later became violent. She withdrew her consent and, according to her testimony, young Philly continued sexually penetrating her against her will. However, Philly denied that account. He maintained that the sexual activity remained consensual, admitting to biting her, but described the marks as consensual love bites and denied choking or slapping her. He eventually went to trial facing 10 charges connected to what allegedly happened inside that hotel room. And now we finally learned the verdict in this entire case. So young Philly was found not guilty on 3 counts of sexual penetration without consent. He was also cleared of the allegations that he impeded the woman's breathing and 1 separate assault charge. However, he was found guilty on 2 assault charges relating to biting the woman. On 3 additional sexual penetration charges, the jury could not reach a verdict, meaning prosecutors could seek a retrial. So the young Philly verdict is in, but the outcome is far more complicated than some headlines make it sound. Now, the case dates back to September 28, 2024, after Philly performed at Bar 1 in Hillary's, north of Perth. After the show, he and a 20-year-old woman returned to the Intercontinental Hotel in Perth. Both sides agreed that the sexual activity began consensually, but their accounts of what happened afterward were completely different. The woman photographed her injuries and reported the alleged assault to the police the following day. Philly continued his Australian tour before being arrested in Brisbane on October 8 that year, 10 days after the alleged incident. He was then extradited back to Western Australia. Now, when the case first became public, Philly was facing 8 charges, 4 counts of sexual penetration without consent, 3 assault charges, and 1 charge of impeding the woman's breathing by applying pressure to her neck. 2 more sexual penetration charges were later added, bringing the total charges to 10. His trial began in the District Court of Western Australia on July 20, 2026. He pleaded not guilty to all 10. Prosecutors accepted that the sexual activity began consensually, but allegedly that it later became violent, that the woman withdrew consent, and that Philly continued without her consent. Now, Philly, he denied that account and maintained that the sexual activity remained consensual from start to finish, denied choking or slapping her, and described the biting as consensual love bites. The court also heard that the woman had been an extremely excited fan before the encounter with Philly. She testified that Philly had been her idol. Videos recorded before the performance and later shown to the jury captured her describing him as her celebrity crush and future husband, and at one point shouting, "I'm gonna marry him." The woman had selected what she considered her lucky white top for the night, and she and her friend eventually gained access to the VIP area, where the court heard they had free drinks and were able to mingle with Philly after he came off stage. She later said she had imagined what she called a David Beckham and Victoria Beckham future for herself and Philly. Now, as the woman is chatting with young Philly in the VIP area of the club, she testified that he put his hands down the back of her pants and told her, "You're coming home with me tonight." According to the woman, she then pushed his hands away, only to have him grab one of her breasts, according to her testimony. And then she told him, "I'm not like that. You can't do that," she said. And then she testified that Philly told her, "It really shows your age." And then now this is what happens after they start leaving the venue. CCTV footage showed her getting into a minivan with Philly and 5 members of his entourage at around 3:30 in the morning. She testified that she believed they were heading to an after party, but the group instead traveled to the Intercontinental Hotel. At the hotel, his security guard took her phone, which Philly later described as standard practice to protect his privacy. She said the sexual activity initially began consensual but later became increasingly aggressive. She alleged that Philly bit her face, neck, and breast, slapped her, and restricted her breathing with a hand around her throat. She testified that the biting hurt and that when she asked him to be gentler, he instead became more aggressive. According to the prosecution, the woman became frightened, withdrew consent, and repeatedly told Philly no and asked him to stop, but he continued several sexual acts. Prosecutors also alleged that she began crying during the encounter. Philly denied the alleged violence and non-consensual activity. He accepted that they went to the hotel, had sex, and that he bit her, but he maintained that the entire encounter remained consensual from start to finish. The prosecution alleged that afterward, Philly called room service and ordered himself a burger. As the woman prepared to leave, prosecutors alleged that one of his security staff entered the room and that Philly made an insulting comment about her sexual performance and that he grabbed her breasts and made another comment about her body. After leaving the hotel, the woman said Philly's security guard returned her phone and she traveled to her cousin's home. She messaged her cousin asking for an ice pack, later testified that her face was sore and said she had been badly beaten. She photographed her injuries and reported the alleged assault to police the following day. The woman also testified that she later messaged Philly on Instagram, claiming that she may have left her car keys inside his hotel room. She told the court that she had not actually brought any car keys that night. She said she sent the message because she wanted Philly to see the injuries she alleged he had caused, but said he did not respond to that message. 2 days later, she was examined at Perth's Sexual Assault Resource Center by specialist Dr. Geraldine Hoy. Dr. Hoy took 21 close-up photographs showing bruising and swelling across the woman's face, neck, and breasts. She said swelling on the left side of the neck could have resulted from pressure obstructing the jugular vein, which she described as a form of strangulation. The woman also testified that one bite to her breast broke the skin and that she later received a tetanus shot, which is a vaccine that protects against serious bacterial infection. And the prosecutors relied on those injuries to support her allegations that the encounter had become violent. Philly admitted causing the bite marks but described them as consensual love bites. Now, under cross-examination, he accepted that he had not specifically asked before biting her and that some bites were harder than others. He maintained that she never said ow or, told him to stop or indicated that she was in pain. A forensic dentist also said that some of the marks were likely caused by biting. The key dispute was whether the bites were consensual, as Philly claimed, or assaults committed after the woman objected, as prosecutors alleged. And after the prosecution finished presenting its case, young Philly actually testified in his own defense. He maintained that the entire encounter had remained consensual. He admitted biting the woman's face, neck, and breast, but later described the marks as love bites, saying she had never told him they hurt or asked him to stop. And then he denied slapping or choking the woman, restricting her breathing, forcing any sexual acts, or continuing after consent had been withdrawn. And then Philly said that the woman made sounds he interpreted as positive and appeared comfortable afterward. Philly testified that after the sexual activity ended, they remained on the bed talking. He described her mood as good, called her personality bubbly, and said she was still enjoying his company before he arranged an Uber for her. One of the prosecutors in the case, her name is Daniel Clark, challenged that interpretation, raising his expectation of sex, the lack of discussion beforehand, his fame, the all-male entourage, and the fact that the woman's phone had been taken. And then during closing arguments, the prosecution relied on the photographs of the woman's injuries and argued that the consensual sex had later become violent and non-consensual. Philly's lawyer, David Edwardson, argued that the alleged sexual violence had not occurred. He highlighted inconsistencies in the evidence, criticized parts of the police investigation, and pointed to the woman's excitement before meeting Philly, including her description of him as her idol, future husband, and the person she imagined having a David Beckham and Victoria Beckham future with. The defense invited the jury to consider whether those expectations and the way the encounter ended affected the reliability of her later account. Now, after an 8-day trial, Philly was found not guilty on 3 sexual penetration charges, 1 assault charge, and the charge of impeding the woman's breathing. He was found guilty on 2 assault charges relating to biting her. And the jury could not reach verdicts on the remaining 3 sexual penetration charges, meaning prosecutors could still seek a retrial. So it's not over yet. And then it was reported that Philly actually cried after the verdicts were delivered. His bail was continued until August 21st, when the case is due back in court to discuss the new steps. So the simplest breakdown is this: 5 not guilty verdicts, 2 guilty verdicts, and 3 unresolved charges. Now, most of this conversation around this verdict is probably going to focus on whether young Philly was found guilty or not guilty, which side people believe, and what might happen next in court. But honestly, I think there is a much more useful conversation buried underneath all of that. Because beyond the headlines, the legal arguments, and people choosing sides, this case raises some serious questions about expectations, communication, and the assumption people make during sexual encounters. And those are the parts that I want to focus on because they apply to far more people than just young Philly or the woman involved in this case. So the first thing I want to touch on is consent. Now, I remember touching on this in my first video about this case, but I want to bring it up again because communication and consent are extremely important. Now, one thing that stood out to me while researching this case was something young Philly admitted during cross-examination. So basically, Philly said that he noticed a woman in the nightclub because he found her attractive, and he specifically mentioned her breasts. He eventually asked whether she wanted to come back to his hotel room, but according to his own testimony, when he invited her back, he expected that they would have sex, and he admitted that he did not tell her that this was his expectation at the time. And the reason I want to mention that is because 2 people can walk into the same exact situation with completely different expectations. Now, to be clear, that does not mean sex was never discussed or consented to afterward. Both sides agreed that the sexual activity initially began consensually. But here's the thing, right? If you are inviting somebody somewhere because you expect something sexual to happen, I personally think it's really important to communicate that instead of assuming the other person automatically understands what is in your head, just so there's no type of misunderstanding. And not in some awkward or overly formal way, but enough so both people understand the vibe and what's going to happen, and nobody's walking into the situation expecting something completely different. And specifically, the reason I'm mentioning this is because this is something a lot of men seem to assume, that if a woman agrees to come back to their house, hotel, or apartment, they're also agreeing to have sex. And that, I think, is a very dangerous assumption, because those are two completely different decisions. When you never communicate your intention and then only reveal it once you're alone with that person in a private space, you can put them in a very uncomfortable position. They may feel pressured, caught off guard, or unsure about how to leave, even if that was never your intention. And another thing to keep in mind is that when a woman is alone in a private space with a man she barely knows, she may feel physically vulnerable or less comfortable speaking up. That does not mean the man has done anything wrong, and it does not prove that crime occurred, but differences in physical strength, familiarity, and control over the environment can affect how safe someone feels objecting, setting a boundary, or trying to leave. That is another reason clear communication matters. You want the other person to feel comfortable being honest, not like they have to go along with something because they are unsure how you will react. So I think a lot of those situations can be avoided by being open about what it is that you want, and then you have to give the other person the space and opportunity to respond honestly without making them feel like the decision has already been made for them. Give them a real opportunity to say yes or no. Clear communication gives both people the chance to understand what is happening and decide whether they actually want to continue. There is no downside to making sure you both are on the same page. And another aspect of this, keep in mind that consent can still be withdrawn even after someone initially agrees to sexual activity. So to me, consent is so much more than just a yes. The way I look at it is it's an ongoing activity, something that has to be evaluated on a moment-to-moment basis. It's almost like when you're traveling in a new city. Let's say you get into an Uber, right? Even though you entered the correct destination on the Uber app, you're probably still looking around as you get closer thinking, am I actually where I'm supposed to be? I mean, you don't sit there completely disconnected and assume everything is automatically going in the right direction. That is kind of how I view consent. You may have gotten a yes at the beginning. You may have entered the right destination on the Uber app, but because you're in a new situation, new person, you still have to remain aware and evaluate how the situation is progressing instead of assuming that initial yes covers everything until the end. And that doesn't mean intimacy has to become some robotic conversation where you stop every 5 seconds and ask the same question. You can pay attention to energy, body language, and responses of the person that you're with, but it's still your responsibility to be attentive. Pay attention to whether they suddenly become quiet, tense, hesitant, uncomfortable, or less responsive. And when you are unsure, especially if anything painful, rough, or physically aggressive is involved, just ask. Don't just assume that because someone agreed at the beginning, they have agreed to everything that happens in the actual situation. But if you are into certain things sexually, especially anything rough, you gotta communicate that. In this case, young Philly admitted during cross-examination that he had not sought her consent before biting her breasts, neck, and face. He described them as love bites and maintained that she never told him to stop or said they hurt. Although the woman testified that she did object and told him he was hurting her. That's what she said. So I think that is where assumptions can create problems. You cannot assume that because somebody agreed to have sex, they also agreed to biting or any other painful or physically aggressive activity. More generally, agreeing to sex does not automatically mean agreeing to every rough or intense act that might happen afterward. Just communicate it first so nobody's caught off guard and both people actually understand what they are agreeing to. And just to be clear, I'm not saying that poor communication by itself proves a criminal offense. I'm really just talking about the practical responsibility and how we as people can reduce ambiguity before a situation becomes harmful or seriously misunderstood. Now, another conversation that's kind of being had about this particular story is hookup culture, but especially among men. I keep seeing people talk about how risky casual situations can become when two people barely know each other, and then you got alcohol involved and probably like these late night situations where things can get confusing. And then you got two people, like two actual human beings coming together, and both people have different expectations of what's supposed to happen. And obviously when you are successful or famous like Philly, there can already be an imbalance in the situation. The other person may feel intimidated, overwhelmed, or less comfortable speaking up, which makes clear communication even more important. And yes, a badly handled encounter can also create serious legal and reputational consequences. But the first concern, I believe, should be making sure the other person feels safe, respected, and able to communicate honestly. Now, that does not mean you should assume every person has bad intentions, because I don't think that's the case. I think most people are actually good. Here's the thing about casual sex. I don't think there's anything automatically wrong with it, but the reality is the more unfamiliar you are with somebody, the less you know about their boundaries, preferences, and way of communicating, the more things you actually got to think about. That means you cannot operate entirely on assumptions. You have to be very clear, because you don't have this established level of trust or understanding to fall back on. In this situation, according to young Philly's own testimony, he saw her in the club, found her attractive, and invited her back to the hotel. He said he expected sex, but he did not communicate that expectation to her at the time. They later did begin having consensual sex, but then you also have the biting, something he admitted he had not asked about beforehand. And that is what stands out to me. There were multiple things happening that had never actually been discussed. Now, I understand this was a, quick encounter. They were not about to sit down and conduct a 3-hour interview with each other. What happens when you take a little bit of time to talk to somebody? You figure out who the person is. You get to chatting a little bit, like the UK boys like to say. You may find out what they're comfortable with, what they're not comfortable with, and whether the two of you are even approaching the situation in the same way. So personally, I believe clear communication could have reduced a lot of the uncertainty surrounding this encounter, not because communication magically prevents every bad situation, but because assumptions become more likely when two strangers who barely know each other and neither person is really saying exactly what they expect. So this story has multiple layers to it, and I think there's a lot of lessons that people can take away from it beyond simply arguing about who they believe. As for young Philly himself, the jury found him not guilty on 5 of the 10 charges, including 3 sexual penetration charges, 1 assault charge, and the charge involving the restriction of breathing. He was found guilty on 2 assault charges connected to the biting, while the jury could not reach verdicts on the remaining 3 sexual penetration charges. So his legal situation is still not completely over. He remains on bail. The unresolved charges could potentially be retried, and the case is due back in court on August 21st, when the next steps are expected to be discussed. But regardless of what happens next legally, I think this entire case should make people think just more about communication assumptions and how quickly 2 people can leave the same encounter with completely different understandings of what happened. So that's what I personally learned from this case. But what do you guys think about this young Philly verdict? I'm curious to hear what you guys have to say, especially about a lot of the things that I was talking about on the second half of this video. So you guys let me know in the comment section below, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace, I'm out.